A note before this one begins. If you like the way these stories move, slow and old and unhurried, there is a companion audio collection under my name where I read a longer set of these tales end to end, without a break, meant for the last hour before sleep. It is not a hard sell. It is only there if you want more of this voice in the dark. That is all I will say about it. There are hollows in the southern Appalachians that the roads still refuse to reach. Not because the terrain forbids them. Not because anyone in a state office ever said no. The roads simply veer, the way water veers around a stone it does not care to move, and after enough years the veering becomes the map. There is one such hollow in the folded country between the Nolichucky and the French Broad, a slow green throat of land the old families called Ansel Hollow, and folks there still do not walk the last quarter mile in past the crooked poplar. They will tell you it is the grade. They will tell you it is the ticks. They will tell you the spring dried up and there is nothing worth seeing. What they will not tell you, unless you have sat with them at a kitchen table long enough for the coffee to go cold twice, is that the last family who lived in the hollow left something behind that should not be possible, and that the impossible thing is still there. Before I go any further, do me a small kindness. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight, and, if you can, one word about the weather outside your window. I read every one of them, and it always surprises me how far this voice carries. Sometimes a name of a town shows up that I have not heard since I was a boy, and I write it down in a notebook I keep for that purpose, and I sit with it for a little while. So say the word wherever you are. Even if it is only your porch light and the sound of a dog 2 houses down. I will hear it. Now, let me tell you about the Ansels. The last family to live all the way in were 4. That is the number I want you to hold in your mind, because the number matters later. For Ephraim Ansel, 47, a broad-shouldered timber cutter with a red beard gone rust at the edges, a walk that favored his right hip from an old skidder accident, and eyes the color of creekstone after rain. His wife, Delphia Ansel, 44, thin-boned and small, dark hair braided down her back to the small of it, a long jaw, a habit of pressing her lips flat when she was thinking. Their son, Ronan Ansel, 16, tall for his age, all wrists and knees, hair the same rust red as his father's, a scar across the bridge of his nose from a barn door when he was 7. And Ephraim's mother, Verba Ansel, past 78, wide as she was tall, her hair white and coiled at the nape of her neck under a black headscarf she wore even indoors, hands mottled with sunspots, a voice like a well bucket coming up full. For Ansels, 2 rooms of a cabin, a smokehouse, a spring house, a low barn, and 38 acres of the hollow to their name by a deed filed in the county courthouse in 1898. The year I want to tell you about is 1911. Late September. The poplars had begun to yellow at the crown, but the oaks were still holding. Ephraim had been working a stand of chestnut up along the ridge for the Beaver Creek Lumber Company since May, and he was tired the way a timber cutter is tired at the end of a season, which is not the same as other tiredness. It sits in the small of the back and in the tendons behind the knees. Delphia had been up to Irwin twice that month with Verba to see about Verba's cough, and the doctor there, a young man named Fraley, had told them plainly it was her lungs, and there was not much to be done except keep her warm and keep the wood dry. Ronan had begun that summer to court a girl named Lena Coker from over the ridge, and he was, in the way of boys 16, both proud of it and terrified of it, and he would not speak about her at supper. He had, that August, walked her the whole 3 miles home from a Sunday singing at the meeting house, and her father had watched him go from the porch and said nothing, which in that country was as close to permission as a boy was likely to get. I tell you all of this because I want you to feel the weight of what they were carrying before anything went wrong. The Ansels were not the doomed family of a ghost story. They were ordinary. They were tired. They were also, in the last week of September of that year, the last people to live inside Ansel Hollow, and by the second week of October 3 of them were gone and the 4th was elsewhere in a way that has never been fully accounted for. Here is where the story turns, and here is where I have to be careful because the not telling is on purpose. You will see what I mean. On the 28th of September, a Thursday, Ephraim came down the ridge earlier than usual. He had cut himself. Not badly, but on the meat of his left hand where the axe haft rides, and it was the kind of cut that would not stop bleeding right away but was not deep enough to send for anyone. He came in through the spring house and Delphia bound it up with a strip of muslin torn from an apron she had been meaning to mend, and while she was tying the knot she said, without looking up, that the well had a wrong sound in it that morning. Ephraim, who was a practical man, asked her what she meant. She said the bucket had come up with the same water it always did, cold and sweet, but the sound of it going down was wrong. Sounded, she said, closer than it should. Like the well was not as deep as it was yesterday. Now the Ansel well was one of the finest in that part of the county. It had been dug in 1899 by a man named Beecher Culp, a well digger of some regional reputation, and it went down 41 feet through shale and hardpan to a limestone shelf that the water ran along in a slow underground creek. Ephraim knew that measurement because he had helped haul the last of the stone lining up the year he was married, and because Beecher Culp had, in the way of a craftsman, painted the depth on the underside of the well lid in whitewash. 41 feet. It had been 41 feet for 12 years. Ephraim went out to the well that afternoon, when the light was going flat, and he lowered the bucket. And he stood there in the shortening light with the rope in his hand, and he listened. The bucket hit water on the fourth count. He drew it up. He measured the rope with the span of his arms, the way a timber cutter measures. It was 9 feet of rope wet. From bucket to lid, the well was 7 feet deep. 7 feet. I want you to sit with that for a moment. 7 feet where 41 feet had been the day before. Not a collapse, because a collapse would have been rubble and mud and a broken lining, and there was none. The stone lining was intact. The water was clear. The water was, as Delphia had said, cold and sweet and the same water. It was only that the bottom of the well had come up to meet the top by 34 feet, silently, in a single night, and left the stone lining hanging. Ephraim did what a practical man does. He lit a lantern. He lowered the lantern. And here is the second thing that was wrong, and this is the thing that made him sit down on the wellstone and put his bandaged hand against his mouth. The lantern flame did not reflect off the water. Not a shimmer. Not a shape. The water swallowed the light the way cloth swallows it, and the water, which he could see plainly, was still moving, still with the small living movement of spring water, and yet no flame rode on its surface. He put his own face over it, and there was no face looking back. He drew the lantern up. He set it on the stone. He said, aloud, to nobody, 7 feet, no shine. He said it twice. 7 feet. No cine. That became the shape of it in his head that first evening. 7 feet and no shine. He would say it under his breath 100 times over the next 10 days. He said it in his sleep. Delphia heard him say it. Ronan heard him say it. It became, without any of them intending it, the phrase the four of them were living inside. 7 feet. No cine. Now, I want to pause here because there is a thing about wells in these mountains that I would like you to understand. A well in Appalachia in 1911 was not a plumbing fixture. It was a covenant. When Beecher Culp dug the Ansel well, he did it under the supervision of a man named Otis Trumbo, 63 at the time, who was the sexton of the small Baptist meeting house down at the mouth of the hollow, and it was Otis who spoke the blessing over the finished shaft with a hand flat against the stone. The blessing was not a superstition to those people. It was a contract between the family and the water. You did not draw more than you needed. You did not throw refuse into it. You did not curse over it. You did not lower a dead thing into it, not even a chicken. In return, the water kept faith with the house. What Ephraim was looking at that Thursday evening was a broken covenant with no explanation for the breaking. He had not violated it. His father had not. His grandfather, whose father had come over the mountains from Ashe County in 1859 and cleared the hollow, had not. And yet the water had come up to meet him, and it did not carry his light. He did not tell his mother. Verba was old and her lungs were bad, and he did not want her walking out to the well in the night. He told Delphia, and she pressed her lips flat, the way she did, and she said only, well then, we will not draw from it until you know what it is. Ronan he told the next morning, and Ronan, who was 16 and afraid of no one but Lena Coker's father, went out and looked and came back into the cabin white around the mouth. He said, it is like looking down a chimney into more chimney. He said that, and I have always thought that was the truest thing anyone said about the Ansel well. They lived 4 days that way. 4 days of not drawing water from the well, of hauling instead from the spring 100 yards up the draw where the water was thinner and colder and had to be boiled longer. For days in which Ephraim, in the small hours, would go out with a lantern and lower it and stand and listen. The well never made a sound. The bucket, when he dipped it, filled and came up as it always had, cold and sweet, but no light rode on the water, and the depth stayed at 7 feet, and after the second day he stopped measuring because there was no point in measuring a thing that had already refused arithmetic. On the second day the birds went. All of them. The barn swallows that lived in the eaves of the low barn, the crows that argued every morning in the black oak past the spring house, the 2 mourning doves that had nested that summer under the porch. All of them, by the noon of the second day, were gone, and the hollow was quieter than any of the Ansels could remember it being since the drought of 1893. Delphia noticed it first. She stood on the porch with a bowl in her hand and turned her head slowly and said, "Listen." And Ephraim listened, and there was nothing to listen to, and that was what she meant. On the third day the flies stopped landing on the smokehouse door. The Ansels kept a small smokehouse, and there were always flies at that time of year, working the seams in the wood, and on the third day there were none. Not on the wood, not on the ham hanging inside, not on the meal bucket by the door. The flies were still in the yard. They were still on the horse blanket flung over the fence. They were only not on the smokehouse, and the smokehouse door, if you stood close to it, hummed very faintly, the way a fence wire hums after a wagon has struck the post. On the fourth day, a Sunday, the dog stopped going near it. The dog was a blue-tick hound named Alder, 5 years old, a solid animal, not skittish. Alder had been born in that hollow. Alder had drunk from the runoff of that well since he was a puppy small enough to fit in Delphia's apron pocket. On the fourth day Alder lay under the porch and would not come out, and when Ephraim carried a bowl of the well water to him, thinking to see, Alder crawled backwards on his belly the length of the porch and pressed himself into the far corner with his ears flat and would not so much as look at the bowl. Ephraim carried the bowl back out and poured it away from the house. Alder did not come out from under the porch for the rest of that day, or the next, or the day after that. He would take food from Delphia's hand if she crouched down to the porch's edge and held it out. He would not step onto the ground. The animal knew. That is the plainest way to say it. The animal knew before any of them what shape they were living inside. On the fifth day, which was Monday the 2nd of October, Verba took a turn. Her cough went from the shallow rattle it had been all summer to something deeper, and Delphia sat with her most of that afternoon, and by evening Delphia told Ephraim she wanted to send for old Mahalia Reese. Now Mahalia Reese, past 70, half Cherokee on her mother's side, was a granny woman of the sort that country still had then, meaning she was midwife and herbalist and one of the last few people in that district who knew the old rules, not the church rules, the older ones, the ones about which side of a threshold to lay a broom on and how to close a house upright when someone died in it. Mahalia lived alone in a slant-roofed cabin down near the meeting house, and she was small and shrunken with a face like a folded map and a voice so soft you had to lean toward her to hear it. Ephraim did not particularly hold with what people said Mahalia could do, but his mother was coughing and his well was 7 feet deep, and he was a practical man, and a practical man in 1911 in that country sent for Mahalia Reese. She came the next morning, walking, with a woven bag over her shoulder and a boy of 10 from the meeting house carrying her second bag behind her. A red-haired boy named Elias, freckle-faced, in patched wool. She sat with Verba an hour. She made a poultice of something bitter-smelling and pressed it under Verba's shoulder blades and told Delphia to keep the fire steady but low, and to open the window an inch even in the cool. She said Verba's lungs were tired but they were not finished. She said it in the same voice she would have used to say the beans were nearly boiled. Then Ephraim asked her to come out to the well. She did not answer at first. She stood up from her stool by Verba's bed with both hands on her knees, and she walked out through the front room and out onto the porch, and she looked at the dog, still there, still refusing the ground. She said, "That is a good dog." Then she walked with Ephraim across the yard to the well, and she stood 5 feet back from it. She did not step up onto the wellstone. She asked Ephraim to tell her. He told her. He told her about the sound of it that first morning, and about the 7 feet, and about the lantern that would not shine, and about the 4 days of hauling from the spring, and about Alder under the porch, and about the birds gone, and about the flies that would not land on the smokehouse door. She listened without interrupting him, and when he was finished she looked at the well another long moment, and then she looked at Ephraim and she said very quietly, "This is not a thing the water is doing. This is a thing the water is being made to do." He asked her by what. She said, I do not know by what. She said, I know a few things. I know that a well that will not show a face is not a well anymore, it is a mouth. I know that when the mouth is close to the top, the house is close to the mouth. I know that a dog will tell you what you already know if you would let it. I know that when a thing arrives on a piece of ground, the small creatures notice first and they leave, and the middling creatures notice next and they hide, and then the last thing to notice is the people, because the people are always the last, being the loudest and the least still. She said, whatever it is, it did not begin here. It has come here. It is asking to be let in. And it is patient. Ephraim asked her what to do. She was quiet for a while. Then she said 3 things. She said, first, do not draw from it, and do not throw into it, and do not speak over it, none of you, not one word. She said, second, cover it. Cover it with the heaviest thing you can move, and lay iron across the cover, an axe head, a plow blade, any iron you have that has been used, not new iron, used iron. She said, third, in 6 days we will come with the sexton and we will close it properly. Otis Trumbo was still living then, though nearing 74, and he was still sexton of the meeting house, and he was one of the few people alive who could say the closing over a well the way it needed to be said. Mahalia said, 6 days. Because Otis was up at his daughter's in Del Rio and would not be back until the following Sunday, and the closing had to be said by a sexton, not by her. 6 days. That was what she gave them. Ephraim did the first 2 things that afternoon. He and Ronan slid the old wooden well cover, a thick oak round Beecher Culp had made in 1899, into place, and they weighted it with the smokehouse door laid flat over the top of the cover, and then over the smokehouse door Ephraim laid the head of his oldest axe, its haft broken years back, and the blade of the moldboard plow that had been leaning against the barn since 1907. Iron over oak over stone. Then they went inside and Ephraim told his mother and his wife and his son to speak nothing over the well. Not a prayer, not a joke, not a curse, not the name of it, not for 6 days. They kept the covenant 3. Have you ever known in your body that something was wrong long before your mind would let you name it? I want you to sit with that for a moment because it matters for what comes. Next. Have you ever walked into a room in a house you knew well and felt the floor was tilted a degree it had not been the day before, and gone back later and measured it and found it was not, and yet known, in the part of you that does not measure, that something in the house had shifted? That is what it was like in the Ansel cabin those 3 days. Nobody said anything over the well. Nobody drew from it. And still, each morning, when Ephraim went out to check the cover was a quarter turn off from where he had left it. Not thrown off. Not disturbed. Only rotated, as if by a hand under the wood, a quarter turn to the right, always to the right, in the night. He would turn it back. In the morning it would be a quarter turn off again. Let's go back to the story, because I have gotten ahead of myself. On the 3rd day of the 6th, which was Thursday the 5th of October, Elias, the red-haired boy who had walked with Mahalia, came up the hollow alone to bring a fresh bag of the bitter herb for Verba. He was 10 years old. He was, by every account I have ever read of him from what came later, a careful, quiet child, the sort of boy who did not run in a house he did not know. He came to the door and Delphia let him in and gave him a piece of bread with butter, and she told him to sit at the table while she went in to Verba. Verba was sleeping, and Delphia sat with her a few minutes to make sure the sleep held. When she came back out, Elias was not at the table. The front door was open a hand's breadth. She went out onto the porch. Alder was standing. That was the first thing she noticed. The dog was standing, all 4 feet on the ground, at the top of the porch steps, and his hackles were up in a ridge from his neck to the base of his tail, and he was making a sound she had never heard him make, a low continuous note that was not a growl and not a whine but somewhere between the two, a sound of a dog holding something back. She saw the boy at the well. The cover was off. Not moved. Off. It was leaning against the well stone as neatly as if it had been set there by hand, and the smokehouse door was laid down flat in the grass beside it, and the axe head and the plow blade were laid one on top of the other on the smokehouse door. Elias was standing on the well stone. He was looking down. Delphia, from where she stood on the porch, could not see his face. She could see the back of his head, and his shoulders, and one small hand curled around the edge of the stone, and she could see that his other hand was extended down into the well, not far, only up to the wrist, as if he had reached in to touch the water, which, by then, was closer to the top of the stone than the top of Delphia's boot was to the porch floor. She said his name. She said, Elias. She said it quietly, because she did not want to startle him. He did not turn around. He said, in a voice that was his voice and not his voice, he said, "They are not deep. They are only far. There is a difference." Then he stepped down off the well stone, and he walked, without hurry, past her and up onto the porch and around her. And he sat back down at the kitchen table, and he ate the rest of his bread and butter as if nothing had happened. Alder, on the porch, did not go for him and did not go from him. Alder only trembled. Ephraim came in from the woodlot 10 minutes later, and Delphia told him. He went out. The cover was as she had said. The iron was as she had said. The water was closer. He did not touch anything. He walked back inside, and he looked at Elias at the table, and he said gently, "Son, do you remember going out to the well?" Elias said, "No, sir." Ephraim said, "Do you remember what you said out there?" Elias said, "No, sir." And then he said, "I am sorry, Mr. Ansel, was I not supposed to?" And Delphia said later, and it is in a letter of hers that I have read with my own eyes, she said the child's eyes when he asked that question were his own eyes again, and they were frightened, and she had to sit down at the table with him and hold his small hand and tell him that no, he had done nothing wrong. He had only fallen asleep for a moment at the table and dreamed something, and she gave him more bread and told him a small joke about a chicken and sent him back down the hollow to Mahalia's with a note pinned to his coat. The note said, "Come tomorrow. Come with anyone you can bring. It is not 6 days. Cannot be 6 days." Mahalia came the next day, which was Friday, and with her came a man Ephraim had not asked for, a man named Josiah Tackett, mid-40s, tall and gaunt with a black beard shot through with gray and a habit of standing very still, who was not a sexton but was a preacher of the shouting sort from 3 ridges over. Mahalia had sent for him because Otis Trumbo was still in Del Rio and would not be back for 2 more days, and Josiah, whatever else he was a man who was not afraid of things. He came with Mahalia, and he carried nothing but a Bible under one arm and a length of iron chain under the other. He walked out to the well and he stood over it, and he read for a long time, and when he was done reading he laid the chain across the cover, which Ephraim had, with shaking hands, put back on that morning. Josiah said, "This is not a thing my book will finish, but it will hold it a night or 2. And then he said, "Brother Ephraim, take your family out. Take them to my sisters in Irwin, or to your wife's people, or wherever will hold them. Take them tonight. Do not come back to this cabin until Otis is back and we have closed this well properly. Do you hear me?" Ephraim heard him. They had planned to leave that night. They had planned it careful. Ephraim would hitch the mule to the wagon at first light Saturday. He and Ronan would carry Verba out to the wagon wrapped in the good quilt. Delphia would bring the small trunk of clothes and the tin box with the deed and the family papers. They would go down the hollow slow so as not to jolt Verba's chest, and they would be at Delphia's brother Lester's house in Chestoa by noon. That was the plan. It was a good plan, made by careful people who had lived on hard ground long enough to know that a thing done at first light in good weather with rested animals is a thing that arrives whole, and a thing done in the dark with a lantern held low is a thing that arrives half-broken, and no timber cutter, no matter how frightened, wants to break his mule on a moonlit hollow road with his mother in the wagon bed. They did not get first light. At 2 in the morning on the Saturday, the 6th of October, Alder began to scream. I used that word deliberately. A dog can scream. It is not a common sound, and once you have heard it, you do not forget it. Alder was under the porch and he was screaming, and Ephraim came out of the bed and did not stop for the lantern, and he came down the porch steps barefoot in his union suit, and he saw in the yard in the moonlight that the well cover was off and standing on its edge and rolling slowly in a small circle around the well stone, all on its own, the chain sliding off it and heaping in the grass like a snake settling. And he saw in the doorway behind him that his mother, Verba, 78, in her nightgown, was standing on the porch, on her own 2 bare feet, upright for the first time in a week, and she was walking toward the well. She was not looking at the well. She was looking at Ephraim. Her eyes were her own, and she was walking anyway, 1 foot after the other, calm, unhurried, as if her body were being led by the hand and her mind were only a passenger. She raised one hand, in a small, almost apologetic gesture, as if to say she was sorry for the trouble, and she kept walking. He ran for her. Now here is the part where I have to be careful again. There is a version of this story that has been told for 115 years in that county, and in the version most often told, Ephraim caught her at the second step off the porch and carried her back into the cabin. And the family loaded the wagon in the dark and left before dawn and were at Lester's by breakfast, and Ephraim and Josiah and Otis, when Otis returned, went back 3 days later and closed the well according to the older rite, and Ansel Hollow was left empty forever after. And that was the end of it. That version is not the whole truth. It is the story Delphia told for the rest of her life, and she told it because she loved her family and because a story is a kind of quilt you can lay over the missing ones. Here is what actually happened. Ephraim caught his mother at the edge of the porch. He carried her inside. He set her on the bed, and she did not fight him. He shouted for Ronan, and Ronan came out of the loft with his boots half on and his face white, and Delphia was already at the tin box, pulling the deed and the papers out of it, and they moved. They moved the way a family moves when they know they have run out of days. They loaded the wagon in the dark by the light of one lantern held low, and they hitched the mule, and they got Verba wrapped in the quilt into the wagon bed, and Delphia climbed up beside her, and Ronan took the reins, and Ephraim said, "Go." He said, "I will follow on foot in an hour. I have to close the door right. Do not wait for me." Delphia said, "Come with us." Ephraim said, "I have to close the door right. Go." And Ronan clucked to the mule, and the wagon moved off down the hollow in the moonlight, and Delphia looked back once and saw her husband standing barefoot in the yard in his union suit, holding the lantern low, looking at the well. She never saw him again. The wagon reached Lester's house at 7 in the morning. Verba lived 4 more days and died on the following Wednesday, quietly, with Delphia holding her hand, in a bed in Chistoa that was not her own. Ronan, 16, went back up the hollow with Lester and 2 other men on the Thursday to find his father. They found the cabin as the family had left it. They found the mule's tracks going out. They found no tracks going back in that were not their own. They found the wagon cover Ephraim had thrown over the doorway to keep the weather out. They found the lantern set carefully on the porch rail, wick trimmed, cold. They did not find Ephraim. They found the well. The cover was on it. The chain was laid across it. The smokehouse door was set aside neat against the well stone. The axe head and the plow blade were laid one on top of the other on the ground beside the cover. And in the mud around the well stone, in a perfect ring, were the bare footprints of a grown man, going once around the wellstone widdershins, that is, against the sun, and ending at the edge of the stone, and not continuing anywhere else. No footprints leading up to the ring. No footprints leading away. The ground beyond the ring, in every direction, was undisturbed. Ronan stood at the edge of the ring for a long time. He did not step into it. Lester, 39, a heavy-set man with a black mustache and a slow, careful voice, was the one who said, "Finally, we have to tell your mother." And Ronan said, "We do not tell her about the footprints." And Lester agreed, and the 2 other men, a farmer named Boyd Whitaker, 51, and Boyd's grown son Grady, 22, agreed, and the 4 of them covered the ring with a scatter of dry leaves before they left the hollow that afternoon, and none of them ever spoke of the ring to Delphia in her lifetime. Otis Trumbo, 74, came back from Del Rio on the following Sunday, and he and Josiah Tackett and Mahalia Reese walked up into Ansel Hollow together, and they closed the well according to the older rite, which involved a stone lowered on a chain and a phrase said over it that Otis would not repeat to anyone afterward, and they capped the well with a slab of quarried limestone, and Otis wrote the date on the underside of the slab with a nail. That slab is still on that well today. I have seen it. The date is October 15th, 1911. And now I have to tell you the thing that has kept this story alive in that county for 115 years, and the thing that I promised at the beginning was still there. In November of 1911, 6 weeks after the closing, a young clerk named Halbert Sawyer, 23, working for the county records office in Jonesboro, was cataloging deeds. He came across the Ansel deed, filed 1898. He noted, in his own handwriting on the margin of the ledger, and I have seen the ledger with my own eyes, that the deed described the Ansel property as 38 acres bounded on the north by the ridge and on the south by the hollow road, with 1 dwelling, 1 smokehouse, 1 springhouse, 1 barn, and 1 well. Halbert Sawyer, being a thorough young man and having heard something of the Ansel matter, went up into the hollow that November with a surveyor from the county named Pearl Whitson, 51, a wiry man with steel-rimmed spectacles and a wool coat too large for him, and they walked the property. They found the cabin. They found the smokehouse. They found the spring house. They found the barn. They found the well capped, the limestone slab in place. They also found 64 feet due north of the well, in a small clearing between two chestnut stumps, a second well. The second well had a stone lining, hand-cut, identical in workmanship to Beecher Culp's, and it was uncovered. It was full nearly to the brim with clear water. When Pearl Whitson lowered a plumb line, the plumb line went down 41 feet before it touched bottom. 41 feet. There is no record of a second well being dug on the Ansel property. There is no record of a second well being commissioned. Beecher Culp, still living in 1911 at the age of 67, was interviewed by Halbert Sawyer that December, and Beecher, clear-headed, said he had dug only one well on the Ansel place in 1899, and there had never been another. There was no permit filed. There was no payment recorded in any ledger. There was no oral memory of it in the Ansel family or in any neighboring family, and I have looked, over the years, in every place a memory of it might have lived, and there is none. The second well is still there. It is still 41 feet deep. Its water is still clear and cold and sweet, and if you lower a lantern into it, the flame rides on the surface the way a flame ought to ride on water, and you can see your own face in it if you lean far enough. 2 surveyors have measured it, in 1911 and again in 1974. Both measurements agree. 41 feet. Neither survey found a shaft anywhere in the ground between the cabin and the north clearing that could account for the water arriving there from the south. I want to say a word about that gap of 64 feet because I have walked it, and it matters to me that you understand it. 64 feet of ordinary Appalachian ground, root-tangled, pine-needled, sloping very slightly uphill from the old cabin toward the north clearing. In November of 1911, Halbert Sawyer and Pearl Whitson paced it and put a chain on it and paced it again. They found no soft ground. They found no evidence of digging, ancient or recent. They probed with an iron rod every 6 feet along a straight line between the 2 wells and struck nothing but the ordinary shelf of hardpan you would expect in that country at that depth. In 1974, a hydrogeologist from the state, a woman named Sylvie Herndon, 39, with short dark hair and a khaki field coat, did the same work with better instruments, and she wrote in her report, which is on file with the state and which I have read with my own eyes, that there was no geological pathway by which the water in the north well could be connected to the water in the south well, and that the 2 wells were, to the best of her professional judgment, drawing from separate and unrelated aquifers, and that the northern aquifer had no other known well in a 2-mile radius. She underlined that last sentence in her report. The pencil mark is still there. So there they sit, 64 feet apart, one capped, one open, one shallow and lightless, one deep and ordinary, and nothing beneath the ground between them but stone. The first well, the one Beecher Culp dug, 64 feet to the south, is still capped. Nobody has lifted the slab since Otis Trumbo set it down. Nobody in that county intends to. You understand? The Ansel family did not lose a well. They gained one. Something took the well they had and gave them a new one in a place there had been no well before, and it left the old one full to the brim of water that would not show a face, and it kept Ephraim Ansel in some manner I cannot fully speak to, and it left the impossible fact of 2 wells on a property deeded for one on a piece of land that had never held more than one, and that fact is checkable, and that is what has kept me from ever fully sleeping the nights I have spent thinking about it. I want to tell you about the years after because the story does not end at the ring of footprints, and the truest part of it lives in what came after. Delphia Ansel, 44 that autumn, lived to be 81. She never remarried. She stayed at her brother Lester's for the first winter, and then she and Ronan moved into a small house on the edge of Chestoa where she took in laundry and mending. She kept a diary from 1912 until her death in 1948, and the diary is now in the archive of a small local historical society I will not name here, because the family has asked me not to. In the diary she wrote almost every night. Some entries are a single line about the weather. Some are longer. But every entry, every single one, from the 7th of October 1911 until the last one, dated the 14th of March 1948, for days before she died, ends with the same 6 words. She would write about the day, about the boys who came for laundry, about Ronan's growing family, about the price of coffee, and then, at the end of every entry in her small, neat, slanting hand, she would write, I hope he found the water. That is all. I hope he found the water. 13,400 and something entries. Every one of them ending the same way. Ronan Ansel lived to be 84. He married Lena Coker in 1915. They had 6 children and 11 grandchildren. He worked for the Southern Railway most of his life, and he was, by every account, a gentle and a quiet man, well-liked, given to long silences at family dinners that everyone in the family understood and did not interrupt. He never went back into Ansel Hollow. Not once. He would sometimes drive with his sons up to the mouth of the hollow, and he would sit in the truck at the crooked poplar for 10 minutes or 20, and then he would turn the truck around and go home. His youngest son, Ephraim Ansel II, asked him once, when the son was 12, why they never went in. And Ronan said only because your grandfather stayed. He said it in a voice, his son told me many years later, that was not sad and not angry, only certain. Alder, the blue-tick hound, lived another 7 years. He never stepped onto ground he did not know for the rest of his life. He would ride in a wagon. He would walk on a floor. He would not step onto grass in a place he had not stepped before, not once, until the day he died in Delphia's yard in 1918. She buried him herself at the corner of the yard where the pear tree had been, and she wrote in the diary that night, and then at the end in her small hand, I hope he found the water. Mahalia Reese lived to be 91. She never took a well job again in her life, though she had taken them before that autumn. When people asked her about the Ansel well in her old age, she would only say, some ground remembers what you owe it, and some ground remembers what someone else owed it, and you cannot always tell which is which until the water changes. Otis Trumbo, the sexton, died in 1913, less than 2 years after the closing, of a stroke at 76. His last words, according to his daughter, were the phrase 7 feet, no shine. She did not know what he meant. She wrote it down because he had said it 3 times, and she thought it might mean something to someone. Josiah Tackett, the preacher, lived a long strange life and eventually left the ministry and moved to Ohio and worked in a paper mill and would not speak of the Ansel well to anyone, though he spoke of many other things, including some he ought not to have. Elias, the red-haired boy, grew up. He became a schoolteacher in Greenville. He lived to be 82. He never remembered anything that had happened at the well that afternoon, and Delphia never told him. He wrote a letter to Ronan in 1963, when Ronan was 68 and Elias was 62, in which he mentioned that he had sometimes, in his life, dreamed of a stone edge under his hand and of a voice, not his own, saying something about being not deep but far, and he had never known where the dream came from, and he wondered if it was of any interest. Ronan wrote back a kind letter that did not answer the question. That letter is in the archive too. An Ansel Hollow. The hollow itself. Nobody has lived past the crooked poplar since October of 1911. The cabin fell in slowly over the next 30 years. The smokehouse fell in. The barn fell in. The spring house still stands, more or less, its roof half off, its stone walls stubborn. The second well, the impossible one, is still open, still 41 feet deep, still full of clear water. Every few years a hiker or a hunter comes out of the hollow and mentions it in passing at the diner in Irwin, and the older people at the counter do not look up from their coffee, and after a while the hiker or the hunter stops mentioning it. The first well, the Covenant Well, capped by Otis Trumbo on the 15th of October 1911, is still capped. The limestone slab is still there. The date is still legible on the underside, if you were to lift it, which you should not. And if you are quiet and you stand at the edge of that clearing between the fallen cabin and the fallen barn on a still evening in late September, you will sometimes hear, from under the slab, a soft, slow, patient sound, the sound of water being drawn up and being drawn up again, and being drawn up again, one bucketful at a time, from a shaft that is 7 feet deep and does not carry any light. I have heard it. I will say that once, and I will not embellish it. On a September evening in the year I first went into that hollow, some years ago now, with the light going the color of a wet penny and the wind laid down flat, I stood at the edge of the clearing for the better part of an hour, and in the last of that hour, from the direction of the capped well, I heard the sound of a rope going over a pulley that was not there, and I heard the small wet knock of a bucket coming up against a stone rim, and I heard the pour of water into another vessel, patiently, without hurry, 7 times, and then a pause, and then it began again. I did not step closer. I walked out of the hollow the way I had come, past the crooked poplar, and I did not look down. The old-timers in that county, when they walk anywhere near the hollow, will not look down as they pass. It is not a superstition, they will tell you if you press them. It is only that the ground there has a habit of asking questions, and it is better not to answer. The younger people, the ones who moved into the newer houses at the mouth of the hollow in the 70s and 80s, they do not walk in either, though they will tell you it is only because the road is bad. Their children will inherit the not walking, and their children's children, and so on, and that is how a place stays quiet in these mountains, for as long as it needs to. Before I let you go tonight, I want to ask you something, and I want to ask you honestly. Do you know a place like that where you live? A place people veer around without saying why. A road that dead ends into nothing you can name. A well or a barn or a stretch of woods that the older members of your family will not walk past after dark, and will not tell you why. If you do, I would like to hear about it. Tell me in the comments. Tell me the county, tell me the closest town, tell me the one detail your grandmother or your grandfather said to you when you were small that you have never quite been able to forget. I read every one of them. Some of them I write down in the notebook I keep, and some of them, the ones that will not let me go, I sit with for a long time, and every now and then one of them becomes the next story I tell. I have another one coming soon, a story from a stretch of the Cumberland where a schoolhouse burned in the winter of 1897 and the bell in the ruin has been heard, some winters, ringing under snow with no rope to pull it, and I would like you here for that one. Between now and then, though, sit with this one. Sit with the Ansels. Sit with the 2 wells and the ring of footprints and the 6 words at the end of Delphia's diary. And when you walk out tomorrow, wherever you walk out to, mind the ground that gives you what you did not ask for.